January 22, 1945, Hill 170, Kangor, Burma. Lieutenant Colonel Simon Trevor gripped his M1 Garand rifle, watching the jungle tree line through pre-dawn darkness. 24 British commandos waited in forward positions, each carrying an American semi-automatic rifle that most British units had never seen. In 90 minutes, 300 Japanese soldiers would assault their position. Trevor knew the mathematics that would govern survival. His men possessed firepower that could fire 4 times faster than enemy bolt-action rifles. The metallic click of a Garand bolt echoed through morning mist. This was not the familiar sound of a Lee Enfield that had served the British Empire since 1895. This was something different. A gas-operated rotating bolt that required no muscle memory of old rituals. Trevor remembered a conversation overheard in Cairo 2 years earlier. An American officer had told a British colonel, "We offered you this rifle in 1939. You said you couldn't afford the retooling. Said the Lee Enfield was sufficient." The British colonel had not contradicted him. That silence was more damning than any argument. Colonel James Hadley of the United States War Department understood what was taking shape across global theaters. America had embraced innovation by adopting the Garand in 1936. Britain had rejected that same innovation in 1939 and 1940, choosing tradition over technological advantage. The choice was proving decisive in measurable casualties and territorial gains. American soldiers with Garands could deliver sustained fire that bolt-action armed enemies simply could not match. General William Slim commanded the Burma campaign, quietly requesting American weapons for British elite units whenever supply lines permitted. Slim was too professional to voice complaints about the Lee Enfield, but his actions revealed understanding. British soldiers needed superior weapons to compete with enemies who themselves carried inferior weapons. The paradox was stark. Britain's most experienced general was discreetly arming his best soldiers with American rifles because British rifles were inadequate. Sergeant Major Edward Pierce had trained combined British and American units, discovering that American soldiers with minimal training could outperform British marksmen through sheer volume of semi-automatic fire. The Garand democratized firepower, giving every soldier capabilities that previously required expert training. Pierce's reports recommending British adoption of American weapons were received with cold silence. The British military establishment could not acknowledge that the Lee Enfield had become a liability. The central paradox haunted every engagement. Britain, the nation that had perfected rifle manufacturing and marksmanship traditions, was fighting with inferior weapons, while America, which had embraced innovation over tradition, armed its soldiers with decisive technological advantages. The mathematics were undeniable. One American rifleman with a Garand possessed firepower equivalent to 3 British riflemen with Lee Enfields in sustained combat. Trevor felt the weight of historical irony pressing down like Burmese humidity. His men would probably survive because they carried American rifles. That fact would have to be entered into official reports, implicitly acknowledging that British leadership had rejected this solution 5 years earlier. 5 years of warfare had been fought at disadvantage because peacetime decisions prioritized tradition over innovation. Bamboo stalks rustled, Japanese soldiers advancing through undergrowth with disciplined purpose. Trevor raised his hand. 24 Garand rifles were raised to firing positions. Safeties clicked off in distinctive American mechanical sounds. When this battle ended, when casualty reports were written, military historians would understand that the outcome had been determined not by courage or training, but by the simple fact that one nation had embraced innovation, while another had clung to tradition until tradition became liability. The first Japanese soldier emerged from the tree line, then 10 more. The assault was beginning exactly as intelligence predicted. Trevor sighted down the Garand, feeling natural in his hands in a way that somehow felt like betrayal. His father had carried a Lee Enfield. His grandfather had carried a Lee Enfield, but his father and grandfather had not faced enemies equipped with weapons that could match their own. When this war began, Britain had decided to fight it with yesterday's answers. Around him, 24 men prepared to prove through fire and blood that a nation could be militarily superior in its choices and still be strategically behind in its understanding of what those choices meant. This killing ground on Hill 170 would be where that reckoning became impossible to deny. The story of the M1 Garand began in Springfield Armory in 1928, in the mind of John Cantius Garand, a Canadian-born engineer with a vision that military establishments initially resisted. For 15 years, Garand developed a concept that officers dismissed as unnecessary. The Springfield Model 1903 was reliable, accurate, proven in combat. The bolt-action mechanism had served since the turn of the century. Why redesign it? Officers pointed to the Lee Enfield as evidence that bolt-action rifles were sufficient. The Mad Minute, 15 precisely aimed shots in 60 seconds, became the benchmark of rifle excellence. But Garand understood something fundamental. Wars were not won by expert marksmen alone. Wars were won by greatest volume of accurate fire. The difference between a weapon designed for perfect accuracy in skilled hands and a weapon allowing average soldiers to deliver overwhelming firepower was the difference between yesterday's war and tomorrow's. By 1936, the Garand had been perfected. The United States Army adopted it as the standard infantry rifle. The weapon operated on elegant mechanical simplicity. When a soldier fired, expanding gases were captured and redirected through a port. Those gases pushed a piston, rotating the bolt and cycling the action automatically. No soldier needed manual bolt operation. No conscious thought required. The Garand fed itself and waited for the next trigger press. A semi-trained soldier could load, point, and maintain fire that would keep enemies pinned or dead. Production began at Springfield Armory. By 1937, the factory produced enough rifles to equip a few regiments. The rate was abysmal by later standards. Winchester declined to manufacture additional rifles, insisting the design was too complicated and expensive. They would wait to see if the design proved itself in actual military use. Winchester's caution seemed reasonable. The Garand cost approximately $85 per unit in 1943, nearly double a Lee Enfield. For Britain, already stretched thin financially and preparing for war, switching ammunition types seemed impossible. The Lee Enfield fired .303 cartridge. The Garand fired .30-06 Springfield. Different ammunition meant different machinery, different supply lines, different logistics. For a nation preparing to manufacture weapons in unprecedented quantities, standardization was survival, not luxury. But there was another explanation nobody spoke aloud. Britain had dominated the world not because British soldiers were necessarily better, but because Britain had convinced itself that institutions and weapons that built that dominance were fundamentally sound. The Lee Enfield was British, designed by British engineers, proven in colonial conflicts and the Great War. The notion that an American, a Canadian immigrant, had designed something superior seemed almost insulting. By 1940, when the offer was formally withdrawn, Britain had committed fully to Lee Enfield production. Hundreds of thousands were being manufactured. The infrastructure was established. Britain in 1940 stood alone against Nazi Germany. The Luftwaffe controlled the sky. London was being bombed. Britain could not afford delay. The nation could afford certainty, and certainty was the Lee Enfield. But certainty proved insufficient. By 1942, American rifles flowed to every theater of war. The Garand proved what Garand himself had always known, that the design was devastatingly superior in practice. An average American soldier, conscripted and quickly trained, could maintain fire that experienced Lee Enfield soldiers simply could not match. Under fire, with seconds to decide, the advantage of semi-automatic operation became absolute. Production accelerated beyond what anyone at Springfield imagined. Winchester finally began manufacturing. International Harvester joined production. Beretta contributed. By 1944, the production rate reached 122,000 Garand rifles monthly. Every American soldier from Atlantic to Pacific could be armed with this single, standardized weapon. The implications spread through military operations. Supply chains simplified with one rifle caliber. Training standardized across all infantry units. Tactics developed knowing American soldiers possessed equivalent firepower at every level. Germany attempted to match this with the G43 semi-automatic rifle, but discovered an impossible barrier. German manufacturing capacity, already stretched by aircraft, tank, and artillery production, could produce only fractions of semi-automatic rifles needed. The majority of German infantry would carry Mauser K98 throughout the war, a bolt-action rifle systematically inferior to the Garand. In the Pacific, Japanese soldiers carrying 5-round Arisaka bolt-action rifles found themselves outgunned by American squads firing semi-automatically. American advance was relentless. Not because American soldiers were necessarily braver. Japanese courage was recognized even by opponents. But firepower volume delivered faster, overwhelmed tactical alternatives. When American infantry advanced across open ground, they advanced under blankets of covering fire Japanese soldiers simply could not match. A single American squad with Garand-armed fire team could suppress entire Japanese squads attempting to maneuver. The result was asymmetrical casualties and rapid territorial gain. Colonel James Hadley, assigned to Pacific Theater Command, watched the campaign unfold with satisfaction, tempered by understanding. The Garand performed exactly as theory predicted, but Hadley carried intelligence that made satisfaction incomplete. America had become strategically dependent on Garand production. If factories were destroyed, if supply lines severed, if anything disrupted Garand flow to the field, American military advantage would evaporate. The weapon that enhanced capability had paradoxically created new strategic dependence on industrial capacity. November 8, 1942, North Africa. Desert heat distorted the horizon as German formations arranged across terrain toward Kasserine Pass. Lieutenant Marcus Whitmore of the United States 1st Armored Division watched through binoculars. 500 American soldiers held positions across a mile-wide front. Most were conscripted within the previous year. They were young, uncertain, and armed with M1 Garand rifles, told to be superior to anything Germans possessed. Theory often dissolved under artillery fire and panzer tanks moving with deliberate precision. Whitmore understood one fundamental advantage. American soldiers would deliver rifle firepower that German soldiers could not match. Wehrmacht infantry carried primarily Mauser K98 rifles, bolt-action weapons requiring manual operation between shots. The standard German division fielded approximately 4,000 rifle-armed soldiers. Each required manual bolt cycling. American equivalent division armed with Garands could deliver firepower overwhelming any bolt-action force. At 09:15 hours, German probing attacks began. Infantry emerged from low hills, moving in coordinated squads with German military precision. They were professionals, many with combat experience from France and the Balkans. They were unprepared for what happened when they entered effective range of 500 American rifles firing semi-automatically. Private James Keating, 21, from Missouri, sighted Garand on approaching German infantrymen. The first soldier fell. Keating chambered the next round without conscious thought. The rifle did it automatically. He fired again. Another German fell. Around him, 499 other American soldiers performed identical actions. The result was not merely increased firepower. The result was fundamental transformation of what German soldiers experienced advancing. German small unit tactics assumed bolt-action opponents suffering degradation in firepower through mechanical rifle operation. Against British Lee Enfields, this assumption held. Against American semi-automatic Garands, it collapsed. When German squads took cover, Americans maintained fire. When German squads attempted maneuver, suppressive fire prevented it. The mathematics that worked in France failed against American semi-automatic salvos. The first German assault was repulsed. 4 American soldiers killed, 12 wounded. German casualties estimated at 67 dead, 94 wounded. The difference was not courage or training. The difference was the rifle. 1 soldier with a Garand worth approximately 3 soldiers with bolt-action weapons. Germans had not yet understood this fully. Whitmore moved among soldiers after engagement, checking ammunition supplies. What he observed was confidence. They had faced German infantry in open combat and prevailed. The Garand had delivered the firepower advantage promised. Over the next 48 hours, American reinforcements arrived. German attacks continued, but diminished as American soldiers maintained fire discipline and leveraged weapon advantages. By November 12th, German forces began withdrawal. The engagement was tactically minor. It changed nothing in strategic situation in North Africa. But it proved something theoretical. American soldiers armed with Garands, operating under competent officers and non-commissioned officers, could match German infantry in direct combat. Victory was not overwhelming. Americans took casualties, but casualties came against more numerous and more experienced German forces, and Americans still prevailed because of semi-automatic firepower. News reached Cairo, Washington, and London through official and informal channels. In the War Office, senior officers who rejected the Garand in 1939 received news with discomfort. Their certainty had been absolute, manufacturing capacity committed, ammunition standardized. The Lee Enfield was adequate. That certainty had been confident and fundamentally wrong. Colonel James Hadley read engagement reports with satisfaction mixed with something more complex. Satisfaction because the Garand performed as designed. Something more complex because these reports would be read by British officers who rejected this same rifle in better times when choices could still be made. Hadley knew, with certainty that engineers possess about their designs, that the British had made an error. In North Africa, Sergeant Major Edward Pierce prepared for combined operations training. British commandos arrived to work with American forces. Pierce discovered what British soldiers needed: American weapons. He spent weeks developing curricula for soldiers trained entire careers with Lee Enfields, preparing them for American semi-automatic weapons. What Pierce discovered was magnitude of shift. British soldiers thought about every shot. Every round had to count. Ammunition was limited. Accuracy mattered above all else. This training created soldiers often more accurate shot for shot than Americans. But the Garand changed equations. American soldiers did not need perfect accuracy with every shot. They needed speed and general accuracy. Volume of fire compensated for lack of perfect precision. Pierce watched British commando officers fire the Garand first time. Realization dawned on their faces. This was not a weapon for expert marksmen. This was a weapon for soldiers. Any soldier. The Garand was democratic. It gave firepower to everyone, regardless of background or training. For officers, raised in tradition valuing distinction and expertise, democratization of firepower represented something unsettling. By December 1942, British commando units equipped with American weapons conducted operations in North Africa and Sicily. Reports consistently describe semi-automatic rifles providing advantages that Lee Enfield-armed units simply could not match. When British commandos fought alongside Americans, firepower differences were immediately apparent. British officers began quietly requesting more American weapons for elite units. These were not official requests. These were not public acknowledgments that British military had miscalculated. These were practical adjustments by officers understanding that war demanded adaptation. By 1943, American War Department understood what was taking shape globally. The M1 Garand was not merely superior rifle. The Garand was becoming foundation of American military doctrine. Production accelerated beyond anyone's expectations. Springfield, Winchester finally cooperating, International Harvester, Beretta, all producing rifles by hundreds of thousands monthly. By 1944, production reached 122,000 Garand rifles monthly. Every American soldier from Atlantic to Pacific could be armed with single, standardized weapon. The implications spread through military operations. Supply chains simplified, training standardized across all infantry units. Tactics developed knowing American soldiers possessed equivalent firepower everywhere. Germany attempted to match with G-43 semi-automatic rifle, but discovered impossible barrier. German manufacturing capacity, already stretched by aircraft and tank production, could produce only fractions needed. Majority of German infantry carried Mauser K98 throughout the war, bolt-action rifle systematically inferior to Garand. The Pacific theater became decisive demonstration. Japanese soldiers carrying 5-round Arisaka bolt-action weapons faced American infantrymen armed with Garands. The result was not competitive. When American infantry advanced across open ground, they advanced under blankets of covering fire. Japanese simply could not match. Single American squad with Garand armed fire team could suppress entire Japanese squads attempting maneuver. American forces took fewer casualties while advancing faster. On June 15, 1944, American Marines landed on Saipan. Japanese garrison of 70,000 held prepared defensive positions. They should have been formidable. They were not. American firepower superiority meant organized Japanese resistance collapsed within days. American forces took fewer than 4,000 casualties. Japanese suffered perhaps 30,000 deaths. The difference was not courage. Japanese possessed that in abundance. The difference was weaponry. American soldiers delivered more accurate fire faster than Japanese could match. In mathematics of warfare, that difference was decisive. Colonel James Hadley watched campaigns unfold with satisfaction, tempered by understanding. The Garand performed exactly as theory predicted, but Hadley carried intelligence that made satisfaction incomplete. German high command was recognizing what Americans had discovered. They lost the infantry weapons competition. Berlin initiated crash programs. Jagdpanzer tank destroyer, Sturmgewehr assault rifle concept, other systems. All emergency reactions to German infantry inferiority. Most significant complications came from Soviet Union. Stalin authorized limited SVT-40 semi-automatic rifle production. Soviet theorists understood what Americans understood. Semi-automatic fire provided advantages over bolt action. But Soviet production never matched capacity. Red Army equipped elite units with semi-automatic weapons while equipping bulk of infantry with Mosin-Nagant bolt action. This mixed approach limited Soviet defensive capability when compared to fully standardized American semi-automatic forces. Sergeant Major Edward Pierce observed this from unique perspective. Pierce trained combined British and American units that would eventually conduct European operations. Pierce discovered pattern repeating itself everywhere. British soldiers with Lee Enfields were professional, disciplined, accurate, but they were consistently overwhelmed in sustained fire contacts by American soldiers with Garands. British soldiers took more casualties while inflicting fewer casualties, despite being often more experienced than American counterparts. Pierce submitted a 1943 report recommending British forces be equipped with American weapons across the board. Report was received with cold silence. Officially, British War Office could not acknowledge that Lee Enfield had become liability. Rifle represented century of military tradition. Suggesting it was now obsolete seemed almost blasphemous in military circles valuing continuity. But privately, most senior British officers knew truth. Lee Enfield was no longer adequate for modern warfare. General Bernard Montgomery received intelligence reports documenting American firepower advantages with professional interest and frustration. Montgomery was finest tactical commander British Army possessed. He had defeated Rommel at El Alamein. Yet he commanded forces armed with weapons inferior to American allies. Montgomery made discreet inquiries about acquiring more Garand rifles for British elite units. Inquiries were met with sympathetic understanding, but practical reality. American production focused on equipping American forces. Only so many Garands available for allies. Situation created paradox few officers could speak aloud. British strategy, planning, and tactical doctrine were often superior to American equivalents. British commanders were, on average, more experienced. But British soldiers equipped with inferior rifles suffered higher casualties and lower success rates than American soldiers operating under less sophisticated doctrine. Tension ran through all combined operations. American commanders understood they possessed advantage beyond personnel skill. British commanders understood they fought at disadvantage despite superior strategic insight. This tension was never spoken aloud in official communications, but it was present in every combined operation, visible in casualty reports and after-action assessments. January 31, 1945. Hill 170, Kangor, Burma. Battle began at 09:15 hours. By sunset, engagement had continued for 7 hours with brief respites. 300 Japanese soldiers attacked successive waves against 24 dug-in British commandos. Mathematics should have been impossible. Commandos should have been dead or captured by noon. Instead, position held. More than half attackers were dead or wounded. Survivors prepared for final assault coming at dusk, when visibility degraded. Lieutenant Colonel Simon Trevor moved along line, checking ammunition supplies, assessing casualties. Unit lost 5 men killed, 8 wounded. Wounded who could fight remained at positions. Those with severe wounds moved to reinforced dugout. 5 killed and 8 wounded against 300 attackers. Casualty ratio should have suggested commandos would be overrun momentarily. The Garand made such suggestions invalid. Firepower these 24 men sustained had kept Japanese at bay through entire day of fighting. Trevor understood with clarity that comes from 7 hours continuous combat what Garand meant to engagement. Japanese came in waves with determination and courage, but each wave walked into wall of fire commandos sustained without diminution. Single American squad with Thompson submachine guns and Browning automatic rifles could suppress entire Japanese platoons. Japanese rifles could not answer with equivalent fire. Arazaka could not maintain volume necessary to suppress advancing commandos. Each assault collapsed before reaching British positions. At 1700 hours, final Japanese assault began with more coordination. Attack came with supporting machine gun fire from 200 yards away. Volume of Japanese fire increased significantly. For a first time, British commandos found themselves under genuine pressure. Suppressive fire from Japanese weapons kept some British soldiers pinned. Ability to maneuver, to shift fire to reinforce threatened sectors, began degrading. But then Trevor saw something that altered dynamic. Japanese machine gun positions supporting infantry assault revealed locations. Trevor directed fire toward those positions. Garand rifles with semi-automatic fire poured rounds at machine gun positions while maintaining fire on assaulting infantry. Within minutes, Japanese machine gun fire diminished as gunners were forced to take cover or abandon positions. Supporting fire that Japanese hoped would help final assault became liability instead. Final Japanese assault collapsed at approximately 18:30 hours. Japanese survivors withdrew toward tree line. British commandos did not pursue. They held positions, maintained perimeter, and waited. Night came with darkness seemingly absolute. Japanese soldiers lurked in jungle surrounding position, but no further organized assault came. By morning, Japanese had effectively conceded battle. They suffered nearly 150 casualties. British suffered 13 total. Position held. General William Slim read battle report with careful attention it deserved. 24 British soldiers armed with American semi-automatic rifles held against assault by 300 trained Japanese soldiers for almost 9 hours. They inflicted casualties at ratio more than 10 to 1. They suffered minimal losses. Tactical success was unambiguous, but strategic implication was something Slim could not avoid. If these 24 men were armed with Lee Enfields instead of Garands, this position would almost certainly have been overrun. Men would be dead or captured. Japanese would achieve objective. Slim understood, in ways only senior commanders could understand, that he was writing report that implicitly acknowledged decade-old mistake. Britain's decision to reject Garand in 1939 and 1940 had resulted in British soldiers fighting at disadvantage for years of war. British soldiers died because armed with inferior weapons. British operations constrained because British soldiers could not deliver firepower that Americans could deliver. Report that Slim submitted went through official channels to War Office in London. Copies sent to General Brooke. Casualty statistics, tactical analysis, mention of superiority of American semi-automatic fire over Japanese bolt action, all noted in meticulous military language, avoiding explicit condemnation while making underlying reality clear. British senior officers reading this report understood exactly what it meant. Lee Enfield had become obsolete, and British soldiers fought with obsolete weapons. But there was no recourse. War was nearly over. Britain could not suddenly rearm entire military with Garand rifles. Production of Lee Enfield would continue to end of war. British soldiers would continue fighting with traditional rifle. Only question now was one of strategic planning. If war ended, if Britain was forced to define military role in post-war world, would Britain finally acknowledge lesson this battle represented? Would Britain finally be willing to reject tradition and embrace innovation? Colonel James Hadley received copy of Slim's report in Pacific Theater Command Headquarters. He read it with satisfaction of vindication. Garand delivered everything that Garand himself promised. American soldiers possessed firepower advantages, allowing them to prevail in engagements where all other factors equal. But Hadley also understood something else report implicitly acknowledged. Lesson had come too late for Britain to learn during war itself. Decision to reject Garand in 1939 and 1940 was decisive moment. That moment had passed. Now it was merely matter of historical record. Sergeant Major Edward Pierce read reports of Hill 170 engagement with professional interest and personal vindication. Pierce had argued for years that British soldiers armed with Garand rifles would outperform those armed with Lee Enfields. Hill 170 battle provided statistical proof. But Pierce also understood that proof presented after fact changed nothing. Damage had been done. British soldiers died because equipped with inadequate weapons. No amount of proof could undo loss. What Pierce understood, and what few others seemed fully grasp, was that Hill 170 engagement exposed fundamental reality about military adaptation. Nations that could adapt to changing circumstances survived and prospered. Nations that clung to tradition died. Britain clung to tradition. America adapted. Difference was visible in casualty statistics and battlefield outcomes. Difference would shape post-war world in ways only beginning to become apparent. September 2nd, 1945. Japan surrendered. Germany surrendered 5 months earlier. The Second World War was over. American soldiers would occupy Germany and Japan. The M1 Garand would occupy territories and nations alongside soldiers who carried it. Rifles survived war that created it. Now it would shape peace that followed. But aftermath of victory brought complicated reckoning. Decisions that seemed justified during wartime revealed consequences impossible to ignore during peacetime. John Garand, the engineer who designed rifle, never became wealthy from creation. United States government, exercising war powers it possessed, determined that all innovations developed for military purposes during wartime were government property. Garand received no royalties, no compensation for design success, no recognition beyond military acknowledgement. He retired from Springfield Armory in 1946, having watched his rifle arm more than 5 million American soldiers. He died in 1957, largely unremembered by public that took for granted weapon helping win the war. Post-war period brought first serious reassessment of what Garand meant. Military historians and analysts examined casualty statistics, tactical records, and strategic assessments from war itself. Conclusion was unavoidable. Garand provided American forces with decisive advantages, compounding across years of warfare. German forces, unable to equip military with semi-automatic weapons, fought at persistent disadvantage. Japanese forces, armed with bolt-action rifles, could not match American firepower. British forces, having rejected Garand in 1939 and 1940, fought at disadvantage until receiving American weapons in final war years. British War Office began, in 1946, conducting formal analysis of how Lee Enfield performed compared to Garand. Analysis was confidential. It was conducted by officers knowing that answer would be inconvenient. Conclusion was undeniable. Lee Enfield was inferior. Garand delivered firepower advantages that Lee Enfield armed forces could not match. Decision to reject Garand had been, in retrospect, strategically consequential. British soldiers died because armed with inferior weapons. British campaigns moved more slowly because British infantry could not sustain firepower that American infantry sustained. But there was no recourse. War was over. Nothing could be changed. Only question was whether Britain would learn lesson that war had taught. Would Britain embrace innovation? Would Britain develop new weapons systems, adopt American systems, reject assumption that British military tradition was inherently superior to innovation? Answer was complicated. Britain would, over following decades, gradually modernize military. Lee Enfield would eventually be replaced by EM-2 semi-automatic rifle, which itself would eventually be replaced by SA-80. Britain adopted American military doctrine, American weapons systems, and American approaches to military innovation. But adoption came gradually, reluctantly, only under pressure of strategic realities, making British military isolation increasingly impossible. Soviet Union faced different complications. Soviet planners, having decided not to fully standardize semi-automatic rifles during war, now faced reality that Red Army was armed primarily with Mosin Nagants, while Americans deployed semi-automatic Garands. Soviet response was not adoption. Alliance between nations had ended, replaced by Cold War, but rather development of Soviet equivalents. Result was development of SVT-40 successor designs, eventually evolving into Kalashnikov assault rifle. Soviet doctrine evolved around assault rifle, which was in some ways more advanced than Garand's semi-automatic approach. But this evolution came years later, after experimentation with multiple designs. By 1950, Korean War began. American forces deployed armed with same M1 Garand rifles, winning Second World War. Garand proved as effective against Chinese and North Korean forces as against German and Japanese forces. North Korean soldiers carried bolt-action Mosin Nagants and semi-automatic Tokarev rifles. Chinese soldiers carried mixture of bolt-action rifles and Japanese weapons captured from Second World War. American soldiers with Garands again found themselves in engagements where firepower superiority translated into tactical advantage. Lesson of Second World War repeated itself. Nation equipping soldiers with superior weapons possessed advantages that could not be overcome by courage or determination alone. Post-war declassification process began slowly in 1950s and accelerated through 1960s. Military documents classified as secret during war were released to historical researchers and public examination. Records revealed clearly what had been understood by military professionals, but not by general public. America possessed weapons system advantages contributing to victory. Garand was one of those advantages. Story of Garand. Rejected by Britain in 1939, embraced by America, proven decisively superior in warfare, became historical narrative influencing military thinking for decades. By 1980, over 35 years after war ended, M1 Garand began being phased out of active American military service. Newer weapons systems, M14 and eventually M16, replaced it. But Garand's design principles, gas operation, semi-automatic fire, magazine-fed ammunition, remained foundational to all subsequent American rifle designs. Rotating bolt system. Garand invented became basis for rifles developed by every military power. AK-47, designed by Mikhail Kalashnikov, incorporated principles echoing Garand's rotating bolt design. Belgian FAL rifle, German G3, French FAMAS, all incorporated lessons learned from Garand's success. Historical irony deepened over time. Garand, rejected by Britain as too expensive and too complex, became most copied rifle design in military history. Every major military power eventually adopted weapons based on principles Garand established. Every military attempting to compete with American capability had to develop weapons matching or exceeding Garand's semi-automatic firepower. By war's end, decision to reject Garand in 1939 and 1940 had become undeniably, historically consequential. Britain fought years of warfare with inferior weapons. British casualties were higher than they would have been with semi-automatic rifles. British military strategy was constrained by weapons available to British soldiers. Opportunity cost, campaigns that might have been won faster, territories liberated sooner, lives that might have been saved, was impossible to calculate but obviously significant. The fundamental lesson was clear. Military capability was not determined by tradition or length of military history. Military capability was determined by willingness to innovate, willingness to embrace new technologies, willingness to discard assumptions guiding previous generations. America understood this lesson. America acted on it by adopting Garand in 1936, committing to production, equipping millions with weapons. Result was that American soldiers possessed firepower advantages compounding across years of warfare, contributing substantially to Allied victory. The weapon that seemed radical in 1936 had by 1945 become the symbol of American military superiority itself.